This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zacharisa.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zacharisa, the editor-in-chief at FanDuel and at numberfire.com, and this is episode 467 of the Late Round Podcast, the many shows that are part of the FanDuel Podcast Network. Thank you for tuning in. It's the last 10 trend show of the year. I hope you enjoy it. But before getting to those trends, I wanted to speak to all the Late Round Podcast listeners in Colorado. Last week, FanDuel, Bud Light, and the Denver Broncos partnered up to bring you the Bud Light Pick and Kick bonus with one goal in mind, to give you more ways to win this NFL season. This week, they're doing it all over again. The program is simple. For every field goal and extra point the Broncos kicker makes against the Chargers on December 27th, fans who placed a moneyline bet of at least $25 on the game will receive a $3 bonus added to their FanDuel Sportsbook account. If Denver kicks 3 field goals and 3 extra points, that's $18 in bonus cash. December 27th is right around the corner, so crack open a Bud Light, download the FanDuel Sportsbook mobile app, and place your bet today. Let's kick things off this week with a Russell Wilson trend, something I've done a lot over the last month. Wilson has given us one top 10 performance since week 8. He's averaging 203 yards per game over his last 5. And over this 5-game stretch, he's thrown multiple touchdowns twice. Things are broken for Seattle right now. And against a Rams defense this week that's given up just 2 top 18 performances while allowing the fewest adjusted fantasy points per game to quarterbacks, I'm telling you right now, Russell Wilson is going to be a sit on the matchup show. Before it's too late, find an alternative. He has a ceiling, of course, because it's Russell Wilson. But objectively, his spot in Week 16, it's horrendous. Over Noah Fant's last 3 games played, he's averaged a target share per game of 28.4%. He's seen target shares of 25%, 25.9%, and 34.4% over this time. Now, that hasn't really translated until this past week. One of those games was the Kendall Hinton contest, though, so we can kind of take that with a grain of salt. But a 25.9% and a 34.4% target share over his last 2 games is great. And in Week 15, it all translated to a top 5 tight end performance. Given the landscape at the position, you should feel pretty good about Noah Fant in Week 16. We've got to talk about David Montgomery. The man is crushing fantasy football. Over his last 4 games, Montgomery has scored 106.1 PPR points. Over his first 9 games, that number was 110. So much of this is touchdown driven, and is driven by the fact that Chicago's offense hasn't played like a total dumpster fire. Now, is that something that will continue? I'm not totally convinced. They've faced a pretty easy schedule over this 4-game stretch. But good teams and good offenses do well in plus matchups. So we can't fault the Bears' offense for doing what they've done over the last month. But regarding the touchdowns, Montgomery had 2 total touchdowns across his first 9 games. Over his last 4, he's had 6. He's also been more efficient and better on the ground, but if there's one obvious difference, it's the scoring. This is why it's always good to associate your running backs with better offenses. They get more scoring opportunities, and in turn, they score more fantasy points. Kenny Golladay came back in Week 3, and he played until Week 8 this year. He's been out since. But since that game, Marvin Jones is averaging 17.2 fantasy points per game and about a 24% target share per game. Over this time period, he's been the wide receiver 12 in PPR points per game. He's averaging more points than Justin Jefferson, A.J. Brown, Mike Evans, Adam Thielen, the list goes on and on. Jones has been quietly doing really well this year after a super slow start. Trend 5 this week is all about Miles Sanders. If you've had some hesitation with Sanders and his workload, hopefully the last 2 weeks make you feel a little bit better. He wasn't unbelievable in Week 15, but for the first time all year, Sanders handled 100% of the team's running back rushes. He's now seen about a 91% running back rush share the last 2 weeks with Jalen Hurts. And now he gets an amazing matchup this week against Dallas. Things have definitely turned around quickly for Miles Sanders. Marquise Brown hasn't had a single wide receiver 1 top 12 performance this year. But the good news is things are at least trending up. Over the last 4 weeks, Hollywood has averaged a target share per game of 37.5%. And he's scored between 13 and 18.5 PPR points in every single contest. He hasn't had a huge blow-up game. But after really struggling for about a month, Brown's starting to really come through in plus matchups. He at least isn't as big of a waste from a fantasy perspective as he was before. Falcons interim head coach Raheem Morris, he said on Monday that Ito Smith was the lead back in that backfield now. And yeah, that's true. That's true when you look at the usage numbers. Smith saw 50% of the team's running back rushes in week 15. Brian Hill was at 42%. But that backfield is absolutely horrific for fantasy purposes. The entire backfield has combined for 41 fantasy points over the last 3 weeks. No running back in a single game has scored more than 6.2 PPR points during this time. And on the season, the Falcons have only 2 performances where a running back, both being Todd Gurley, ended up finishing higher than RB10. So we're now 15 weeks into the season, and the New England Patriots have a .42 pass-to-rush touchdown ratio. The data I work with goes back to 2011, and since that time, the lowest pass-to-rush touchdown ratio before this season was .59 by the 2016 Buffalo Bills. New England's current pace of throwing touchdowns this season, it would put them at a little over 9 touchdowns by the end of the year. We haven't seen a team with fewer than 10 passing touchdowns since the 2012 Kansas City Chiefs. Things are not going well for this New England passing attack. Aaron Jones had his best backfield share game in a long time this past week. In fact, he had a 91% running back rush share when he hadn't even hit 80% this season. And this all happened in a game where Jamal Williams got hurt. That means if he's sidelined in week 16, you can feel even more confident in Aaron Jones' production. The last trend of the year is about Deshaun Watson. Watson hasn't been as good of a fantasy quarterback thus far without Will Fuller. But he's still been a good passer, because Deshaun Watson is really good, and honestly, he might be underrated. On 15-plus air yard throws over the last 3 weeks, the 3 weeks without Will Fuller, Watson has completed 55% of his passes for 296 yards and a touchdown. He hasn't thrown a pick. His 20 deep ball attempts account for 18.3% of his total attempts. With Will Fuller, he was completing 54% of those throws, so a lower number than without him. He was throwing it deep on 19.3% of his throws with Will Fuller. So we've seen a decrease of about 1%. But basically, his ability to complete those passes and his rate of throwing them, that hasn't really changed. Even his yards per attempt on those throws hasn't fallen dramatically. What has changed is touchdowns. With Fuller, Watson threw a touchdown on 15.7% of his deep ball throws. Without him, that's dropped to 5%. I do think Fuller has something to do with this. We know that he's a really good wide receiver. But I would also argue that since Deshaun Watson's 15-plus air yard numbers look just slightly worse without Will Fuller, that Watson does have some regression coming. He should be a strong option in your fantasy football finals. That's going to do it for today's show, though. Thanks to all of you for listening. If you've yet subscribed to the Late Round Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it pretty much anywhere podcasts can be found. And don't forget to follow me on Twitter @LateRoundQB. Thanks, everyone. I'll talk to you tomorrow with the weekly matchup show.